I got really angry today when I was leading a group coaching call. And I was angry not at the person I was talking to, but at the system that claims to be responsible for administering mental health services for people who were abused and neglected as kids. And I was angry because the massive void where up-to-date knowledge is supposed to be. This has a name, by the way. It's called complex PTSD. Well, most providers don't know what it is or what it isn't, and many of them are doling out inappropriate and ineffective advice and treatment. And millions of people are stuck. They can't recover. And even if they had access to professional help, and I'm telling you, most people do not, well, even if you have it, you're not that likely to benefit. The world is full of people who have CPTSD, and they've tried and tried everything that they were told to do, but without the information about what the symptoms are and how you actually can calm them, they're functionally imprisoned in a broken system that favors outdated ideas and dependence on them. It consumes all the resources of your insurance plan, if you have that. The cash cost of it is prohibitively high for most people. But they believe that they dole out the healing rather than, what research shows, what common sense says is that you can manage and you can use each day techniques to calm your symptoms. Yes, you can consult professionals. And yes, there are some people who are in a mental health situation where they must be under the care of a doctor. I know that. But for most cases of CPTSD, there's a system that provides stuff that doesn't work. The old treatments are not really a fit for complex PTSD. That's pretty much all you're going to get, but they are not a fit. There is a very poor evidence of efficacy, really, associated with talk therapy or medication for these things. Talk therapy and medication are great for certain things, but they don't seem to be that effective for complex PTSD. So there are techniques you can use, there are approaches you can use. Most of them need to be self-managed because you need something that feels helpful, whether or not you have access to mental health services, whether or not they know anything about trauma and healing in the last 15 years, discoveries, whether or not their approach for treatment works for you. So there's basic stuff that ought to be the first line of treatment, and it's not recommended. This is what happened in the call today. A new member, has had a serious depression for 4 years, and this is the first time when they encountered my videos, it was the first time they'd heard of complex PTSD, and they had an extremely traumatic childhood. So I'm just trying to understand, they've been in the care of a doctor and a therapist all this time and heavily medicated. I'm trying to understand, how is it that they didn't know about complex PTSD? It's distinct. It's distinct from general anxiety and distinct from depression. It's distinct from ADHD. It's distinct from borderline personality disorder. I think a lot of professionals are out there, they're just lumping it in a way that makes sense to them, given that they haven't read even the most basic research reports. There's very popular books that have been out for a decade that explain this from the point of view of the patient. Two that I would recommend, by the way, if you want to get into this, are Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, and also Pete Walker's CPTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. Those are two books that give a deep view that, for me, they just the light went on, that's what I have. And I've been talking about what I learned in those books. I've been reflecting on my own experience having this and how I've recovered. And that's why you see thousands and thousands of people coming onto this channel and saying, I have that too. It is described now. And to me, it's basically tyranny to not incorporate knowledge of this condition, which is a known thing now, to not incorporate that knowledge in the way that people access treatment. Because there's a lot of suffering that goes on with CPTSD. I'm mad today. I'm just mad today. I can't even believe that you can get away with charging money to help traumatize people and not know what this is. So I was wondering, is the lack of evidence-based treatment out there ignorance or is it malpractice? Is this your problem for having symptoms, or is the problem that the dominant paradigm has stripped you of your agency, your autonomy and power to heal your life? And they take money, but they position themselves, the mainstream healthcare and mental health care, they position themselves as the authority. We know what this is, and all treatment must come through us. If you watch my channel, we have so many therapists and doctors who value what they get here. They share it with their patients. They use it for themselves and take my courses. But I still get these mails from occasional therapists or psychiatrists going, how dare you? You have no qualifications to talk about how to heal. And I'm just like, are you freaking joking? Do you think that people who have themselves recovered have no qualification to talk to their peers about the path they followed? It's just such an arrogance. It really bothers me. It bothered me because this person I was talking to this morning on my coaching call, it's a group coaching call that we have for members. She really had just discovered what this is. And like so many of us, it's this incredibly freeing thing when you find out, so I'm not crazy, I'm not a bad person. The symptoms that I have are almost verbatim. They follow a very normal pattern for people who were abused and neglected when they were kids. So it's not crazy. It's normal. You're a normal person if you have these symptoms. So this is stuff like, ADHD type symptoms I mentioned, emotional dysregulation, endocrine disruption, higher rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, hypertension, reproductive disorders. There's a whole realm of physiological disorders that are connected to a history of trauma. There's a high correlation between the amount of trauma you went through when you were a kid and how much you suffer from chronic disease, and things that have to do with a compromised immune system, compromised endocrine system, and difficulty just healing tissue. Your vital signs become dysregulated, out of sync when you're under stress, when you had this kind of background. I mean, to me, this was earth-shattering. It explained so much, so many of the things that afflict people who had abuse and neglect as a kid. Migraines, arthritis, asthma, sleep problems. So many of the things that I've suffered with are very common, classic. And when I was a kid, I had this, horrible stomach upsets all the time, especially when things were stressful. Go to the doctor. It was just always a great mystery to them. But now we know. And now there's no excuse not to know. And so I'm calling it tyranny. I'm calling it tyranny because every person has a right to expect their healthcare system to have basic knowledge about what this is. It would be terrible for them to be performing surgery but not understanding about infection prevention, right? Terrible things can happen when you don't know about that. So that was figured out a long time ago. But we have known for 10, 20 years that complex PTSD is a different animal. I'm still hearing all these professionals going, oh, that's just ADHD, that's just BPD, that's just, whining. And actually, it's a thing. It's a thing with a predictable pattern. It can be measured on a brain scan. Complex PTSD, it's a thing. So if you were abused and neglected as a kid, and I'm talking something new to you, please research. You can look at my channel, look online, complex PTSD, learn the signs of it. There's a lot of literature out there that's actually pretty unenlightened. You get these websites about health conditions, and they just say things, and it's not very up to date. The important thing to know is that trauma when you were a kid is highly correlated with the more trauma you had as a kid, the more likely that you have an autoimmune disease, the more likely it is that you have depression, anxiety, smoking, addiction. We knew, it's been common sense for a long time that traumatized people have a higher rate of addiction, tend to get depressed, tend to get anxious. That is understood. But cancer, diabetes, obesity, really, people didn't know that. So it's so important. This is a critical issue. I think traumatized people are the most expensive people in the healthcare system. So it is in their best interest to come up with treatments that work. But one sign that a treatment doesn't work is that healthcare systems don't fund it very well. And this is what I want to call out. This is going to be controversial for some of you. But there is poor evidence that talk therapy targets complex PTSD very well. Many talk therapists will tell you it does, but if you've ever noticed, if you have access, virtually, very few, a small percentage of people in the world could access therapy if they wanted to. That cannot be oh yeah, you just need therapy, right? It cannot be that. People need something they can manage themselves. It also can't be something that other people control. So I can't tell you how many messages I get from people who say, I'm desperate, I don't know what to do. I got diagnosed with CPTSD and now I have to wait months to see anybody, or even years in some cases, like in the UK, years to see somebody who can help you with CPTSD. Well, can they help you with CPTSD? And given that it's such an expensive problem to have, that so much chronic disease is associated with it, if they thought that what they had worked, I'm just going to ask, wouldn't they be giving it? So what I notice is, I used to work in healthcare for 30 years, services tend to be scant or withheld if they can't produce results. And the results that a healthcare system needs is people need to get better and they need to not be so expensive. So I'm asking that. Does it not behoove the mental health care system and healthcare system to figure out what actually helps reduce the dysregulation that in turn triggers all this symptoms and chronic disease that are so expensive for healthcare and that make our lives so difficult and hard? Should that not be of top priority? So I'm just saying, if anybody out there, are you a researcher? Come talk to me. I want to help. I want to help with this. I have simple self-managed solutions that I teach for free. I have this free course, The Daily Practice. You can take it, try it out, see what you think. See what you think. I've got over 100,000 people using these techniques right now. And I'm sure there are many who did not find it helpful, and I don't hear from them again. But I've got 100,000 people who have found it helpful, talking to me about it, coming back and saying this was life-changing for them. And I won't make any claims for the technique, but just that tools that you have in your hand that you can use as needed, which is how CPTSD is. You can't wait for, your Tuesday at 11 o'clock. You cannot wait for that and then once a week somebody doles out healing to you, which is normally done by talking about the past. All right, don't get me started on the past. Talking about the past, it's relevant. What happened is relevant. It can often help people to get a little validation. That happened to you? Well, that constitutes trauma, and that would explain why certain things are hard for you. But talking about the past is not itself the solution. It might be validation to go, okay, there's a reason why I struggle. But it's not itself the solution. And that is what was always presented to me when I used to go to therapy, is that just keep coming back week after week, year after year, keep talking about it. And I kept thinking, well, I don't know, where is all this going? Am I going to have some big breakthrough because I talked about it? Am I going to have an insight? That's not where it came. And I'll tell you where it comes from. Everybody's healing, whether or not you have access to professional help, whether or not you find it incredibly great or not that great. Everybody needs to have a way to self-regulate. Everybody needs a way to self-regulate, to deal with the intense emotions that come up for traumatized people, to deal with that sense of discombobulation that can happen under stress. Do you ever get that? I had a really bad thing happen once. Somebody died. And in that week, twice, I drove away from a gas pump with the nozzle in my car and, yanked it out of the machine. I was dysregulated. At the time, that word was not in the vocabulary given to me about what was going on. People would say, oh, you're stressed or you're preoccupied. No, it's a neurological injury that comes from a history of trauma, that when a new trauma happens or any kind of stress, your left front cortex can start to go dim. That's where you should be reasoning. The right front starts to activate. That's where the emotions are. And all hell breaks loose. Life is very difficult to manage when you're having trouble reasoning and your emotions are quite strong. It's hard to make decisions. It's hard to set boundaries. It's hard to see a red flag and then act on seeing that red flag and stay away from that person. And this explains so much about why you see people who had trauma making these mistakes that just seem like dumb mistakes. I had somebody in the comment today, I gave them a bad time, and they said, this person just seems like dumb as a cat or something. Dumb as a chicken. That's what it was. Dumb as a chicken. Just kept going back to that guy. It's like, yeah, that's what trauma does. It's not because you're dumb. It's because you have a brain injury. And I just want to talk about human freedom. Like, a person cannot be free if they cannot control symptoms that are dominating their life and pushing them into a terrible situation, a terrible set of decisions that cause them to be impoverished, ostracized, and further abused. And the thing about abuse, like, for a person who doesn't heal, that will often, if that person has children, then the trauma is very easily passed on to the next generation. That does not have to happen. It doesn't have to happen. But we cannot pretend that the mental health care universe owns this issue and knows what to do and should always be consulted. I had this major, so there's a major, website that deals with, adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And I was invited to post my blog posts there, and I would, and sometimes videos. And I put one up there about how, it was a little bit about this, about myths that have been perpetuated, that you should always be talking. And I wrote about my experience that talking about my trauma tends to be so dysregulating that I can't process information. I can't recover doing that. But what I can do is I can write my distressing thoughts. And I teach this very specific technique to write, daily practice. You can find that in the description section below. So I did a blog post about how, for me, writing about the troubling things and then perhaps reading to somebody was a way I could bypass the triggers. And I've since learned, yes, there is scientific backing for why that works. It's a different pathway for when you talk about trauma versus when you write about trauma and read what you wrote. You can bypass the trigger that makes talking about trauma so overwhelming and intense and dysregulating. So I was talking about that, and the editor of the publication said to me, oh, Anna, this is all well and good, something to that effect, but it's important to mention that nobody should use these techniques if they're not, when they're except under the supervision of a licensed therapist. And I'm talking about writing fearful and resentful thoughts on paper and then meditating. Now I ask you, how realistic is it that even a rich person who has incredible access to therapy could refrain from meditating except under the supervision of a therapist? That's crazy talk. I think a lot of people on the front lines of healthcare probably have the best understanding of what trauma, how it plays out. They don't always have the training. I have a good relationship with my primary care doctor, and she lets me know like what she's being trained and kind of keeps me in the loop. Gradually it's coming that there's training, but what they're being trained to do is to screen for it because they know it affects health. So they screen, they ask the questions, but I was like, what is the intervention? And I don't think that institutionally there's a lot of solution out there. During the pandemic, do you remember what a shortage of therapists there was? And people were unable to get help at all. They were unable to get help. Certainly in my healthcare system, they were overwhelmed, unable to get help. A lot of their mental health workers were coming to me and saying, I'm so burned out and freaked out, I need help. Because they were, if they still were doing that work, they were getting so many clients, they couldn't handle it. And there's a loss of confidence that anybody feels when they feel like they can't make a difference. And so the people who have never been at the table before are the people like you and me who have CPTSD and who are using our minds and our experiences and researching to understand what works for us. It's a little different for each person. But what works for us? Now, if you say what works for you and you put it out there, you tell your doctor, do you get believed? Do you get respected? I did not always. I do now. But, I have this YouTube channel and things that back me up and make me look like I'm some kind of an expert. You're an expert too. You've been having to be your own therapist, your own doctor, your own parent. You had to take care of this stuff all your life. You have a lot of knowledge about what works for you, but sometimes it's that crucial piece of information that what's happening when you had trauma is quite often neurological dysregulation. Now, therapists and doctors will say, oh, I know about dysregulation, but what they mean is emotional dysregulation. Emotional dysregulation is the kind other people can see, where we're overreactive, we're too angry, we're too sad, we fall in love too fast. That's emotional dysregulation. What they cannot see is the neurological dysregulation. So what you might feel when that's going on, you might feel discombobulated, a little like, I can't remember why I came in the room. I don't remember driving. I remember like getting started on this driving journey, but I don't remember crossing the bridge. And yet here I am across the bridge. You might feel numb in your nose or hands or face. You might walk into a room and just not know why you came in there. You might have trouble governing your energy or keeping track of time. It's dysregulation. It's a neurological injury. The first thing that is so helpful for healing, no matter what modality you're going to use, it's so important to know how to re-regulate, how to notice dysregulation signs and then bring it back in, get re-regulated. If you can live your life more regulated more of the time, You're going to still get dysregulated sometimes. Everybody does. But if you can notice it and then get re-regulated as quickly as possible, your life is going to get so much better. And all the books in the world, all the talking in the world, all the drugs in the world, like nothing can reach you when your dysregulation is out of control. And people they can't see what's going on with you. It doesn't look like much. So they see kids who are fidgety in class or can't focus, right? It's, I'm not a doctor or scientist, but I read, and it is, speculated by many researchers that some ADHD cases are really complex PTSD. And in a way, that's good news. CPTSD is probably more malleable. There's more you can do to heal. You have some control over these symptoms if you can start to zero in on them and work on them. It's not like you're not born with it. Another thing that it gets confused with is borderline personality disorder. These are two separate things, and I won't pretend to be able to diagnose borderline personality disorder, but there's clear evidence these are two separate things with some overlapping symptoms. There's overlapping symptoms between complex PTSD and autism, but they are distinctly not the same thing at all. Autism, is something you're born with. CPTSD is an injury. There are some symptoms that are similar, and it would be things like reading the social cues, being tuned in. With CPTSD, there's an injury to the ability to connect with other people, and that's going to manifest in many ways. And you probably have gone through your life with people thinking you're spaced out, you don't care, you're just too angry, you're too sensitive, right? You get called all this stuff. People think you have bad character. You just don't care. You just keep making the same mistake over and over again. That's me. And nobody understood. And that's why it's so incredibly empowering when you talk to other people with CPTSD and you read the research and you find out what is actually normal. What is a normal response to an abnormal event in your childhood or series of events? You're normal. And you can learn to start noticing and calming those symptoms, and then you begin to be on a level playing field with other people to start solving life's problems. And if you grew up with trauma and you've lived your life dysregulated, I know we get problems. There's money problems, relationship problems, not being able to get along, not feeling connected, joining groups but never feeling like a part of them, feeling like we have to isolate all the time. These are the common symptoms. It's a pattern. And you can learn to start treating those things. And I had to heal myself, basically. I got a series of mentors. I did see 11 therapists in all over the years. And I would not say those have been helpful, but at least what it was helpful is just to say, this isn't going anywhere. I got to do something different. So when I was going through a crisis, and the therapist and my primary care doctor were saying, you have got to take medication because the stress that you're going through. What was happening was, I now know I had complex PTSD from childhood underlying everything. I would sometimes be able to sort of keep that compartmentalized. But a bad thing happened. My partner died. I found him. I got total PTSD. Tried to save him with CPR. Very difficult, horrible experience. But it's the sort of experience that can give a person PTSD. And I got it. And that's actually well known. I was never diagnosed with it. And I saw the doctor, and then I saw a therapist. Go doctor, therapist, doctor, therapist. I was struggling. It was a year and a half later, and I just wasn't getting any better. And I was looping and looping and looping on the memory of finding this guy and trying to save him. And I would have to drive past the house where all of that happened, like every day. It was down the street from where I lived. And I was getting exhausted. And I mentioned to the doctor, I'm just tired all the time. I just feel so stressed out. And she was a good doctor. And she asked me, like, what's going on? And I told her, I keep looping on this thing that happened and I can't stop thinking about it. And every time I do, my heart starts pounding and, I just get full of adrenaline. And she was like, oh, well, we have to medicate that. That was her solution to that. Well, I had PTSD. PTSD does not tend to respond to medication all that well. Not everybody knows or respects that, but some people respond to medication for things. PTSD, not so much. And what I've learned about it from my own experience is that healing that depends so much on becoming aware, like, when am I getting dysregulated? When are the symptoms kind of activating and kicking up? And then using my tools to bring it back down. And what happens is, if you're drunk or high, and yes, the research shows that even on, psychoactive mental health medications, it can inhibit that process of learning to re-regulate. So medication is often like, it's for situations that must be dealt with. And so learning to re-regulate may not be in the cards at that time. But in time, to really learn how to re-regulate, you need all your senses. You need to feel the little edges of those negative feelings. I say this with full understanding. Some people, they don't need to feel it. They need professional help. They need medical help. But for the vast number of people who are just struggling with some old traumas, learning to re-regulate is the most powerful thing they can do to support whatever else they're doing. Some people do somatic body methods. Some people do talk therapy. Some people are under the care of a psychiatrist. Some people are doing martial arts. Some people are in 12-step programs. Some people are in a combination of all of that. But none of it is any good if you can't stay regulated and hold your focus and be able to, keep your adrenaline level down and process information. That's what I'm saying. So I was angry. I was angry that this woman had suffered for 4 long years and she was under all this care. They had medicated her to the gills. She was sick and tired of it. And I can't speak to whether she needed that or not. She didn't feel that she did. But no one had ever used the phrase complex PTSD to her. She didn't know about it. It was just treated like this was some random thing wrong with her without considering what had happened to her. I believe that every person needs to be sovereign over their healing. Sovereign means you are the queen, you are the king, you are in charge of your healing. We consult professionals for help. In rare cases, we are incapacitated because of a debilitating condition physically or in mental health, where somebody has to make decisions for us. But other than that, we must be in charge of our healing. And what bothers me is the mindset that gets propagated is you can't even work on this or help other people or talk about it unless you're under the supervision of these magical people who were educated and licensed in this thing that still doesn't formally recognize CPTSD. Well, I challenge that. I stand up to you. We must do that for ourselves. We must learn to support each other. We must learn to re-regulate. Healing is really only possible. There's a little bit of healing you can do in isolation, but ultimately it's your connection with other people. It's identifying, yes, what happened, but then what am I doing? What are the behaviors that are defeating me and sabotaging my healing right now? We start to work on those. That is something that I found very hard to get help with from professionals, was my moral failings, the terrible mistakes of dishonesty and unfairness to other people that I was doing. It's the stuff that we talk about our parents doing to us, but there's this weird firewall where we go, they did all this bad stuff, but we are just, the victims of this. But actually, every single person has these problems where we have moral failings and we need help changing them. We need help not being verbally abusive to people, not violating, commitments in our marriages and relationships or in other people's marriages. We need help respecting children and not creating drama for them. That's what I mean, to have moral healing, to do the right thing, to recognize the right thing, even though you weren't taught this at home as a kid. There's a place where you can learn that. And these are challenging times. I think people used to get that in church. Some still do. But, as we know, like so many of our institutions, including churches, there's corruption, there's lying. People don't know who to trust. So here's what we do here. We come together and we grow in our own trustworthiness so that we can support others. That's what we do at Crappy Childhood Fairy. It's one person putting out a hand to another and we help out. And I see this also in 12-step programs. One person does the best they can and they give a hand to the person who hasn't quite come as far as them. But in the end, that's what we're working out. And that is what you'll find in 12-step programs, is like Crappy Childhood Fairy, there's an opportunity to work on where you have made mistakes and where you want to change your own behavior. And for people who know that this is where they're self-sabotaging, I think this comes as delicious information, like, yes, how do I do that, right? And you can't. Go down in the links below if you want to know. I have courses, I have coaching programs for you. That's what we work on, re-regulation and then solving the life problems that are so common for people like us. But how we solve those problems is we have to start recognizing is it just me, or am I being unfair to this person? All these letters that people send me, that's almost always the question. Am I being a jerk, or do I need to set a boundary with this person? Am I just being clingy, or is this person treating me badly? Growing up with somebody who didn't properly parent you, without that teaching of how do you be a good person? What is the right way to act? How do you recognize a fellow good person? When I first started Crappy Childhood Fairy, it was a blog, and the initial name was Feral Girls Guide. I thought it would just be for women. And I used the word feral because that's how I felt about myself. Like I had just not learned 80% of what you have to know to be an adult. I didn't know. I literally didn't know how to use a knife and a fork together. Okay, I grew up in a very hippie environment, and I didn't learn that till I was older. I didn't know when to apologize. I didn't know why you need to be really honest about things. I just sort of okay, here's a story. We moved to another state, and I went to this school that was very old-fashioned compared to the one that I had gone to previously. In my previous school, if all the kids got in trouble for something and the teacher said, "Who did this?" we would all lie. That's just what we did. In my new school, it was this strange new thing. So everybody had been acting up when the teacher went out to go to the bathroom. She came back and things had been thrown, and she said, "That's it? Who did this?" And so I was one of the kids who did it, but I lied. I just I didn't do it. Everybody else who did it, they said, "I did it." And I instinctively knew, I love this. I love people telling the truth. This is so comforting to me. I was so confused from growing up. My family had alcoholism. So alcoholism almost always involves a lot of BS, just a lot of pretending you're okay to people, denying why mommy is asleep. There's a lot of lies. And you end up recruited to participate in the lie, and you end up really unable to detect the difference. And I think what's happened in our culture is in an effort to help people who are really downtrodden, poor, left out, that sometimes we just try to make it so, there's no culpability. You're never responsible for yourself. And you're not supposed to say personal responsibility. That has all these associations of the army and, or extremism or something. But personal responsibility just means it's just the acknowledgement that though it's not my fault that I was traumatized as a kid, nobody is coming to save me. That if anybody's going to change my life, it's going to have to be me. And it might as well be me. And so for me, I benefit from my relationships to the people around me. I don't live on an island, but I can't even have relationships with people around me if I can't have a basic amount of healing from trauma. So I just hear a lot of talk. And what I think happened is people who work on the front lines of healthcare tend to know a lot more realistically what goes on with people. Although we're all capable of drinking Kool-Aid, we get very ideological. We think there's one way, it's never this, it's always that. Don't hold your kids, always hold your kids. There's all this ideology about how to do things, and obviously instinct and common sense have to play a role. But the public health sector, I think, and I've worked in public health for a long time in the past, and I've seen this happen in other areas besides trauma. But what happens, public health is largely funded and rewarded by funding, either grant funds from philanthropists or government funds. And what gets funded tends to be things that are popular. In trauma, I'll tell you what's a lot more popular than helping us is helping children. And I think there's common sense to that. If you could avert trauma for kids, that would be amazing. It would be amazing if you could have a world where there was no more trauma. There are, in fact, organizations who claim they are eliminating trauma. And to that, I think that's really unrealistic. I think that's grandiose, in fact. And I think it sounds good, but it is human nature to do what rewards us. And so if you're an organization who works in trauma and you get funding, if you make audacious claims like we're going to end trauma, or you make audacious claims like, we're going to solve this problem and therefore you'll never have that problem. Oh my gosh, it's always so complicated, isn't it? But what you see in healthcare and then also this sort of philanthropy funded sector is always the locus of control is on the sort of caregiver, the practitioner. And they say the word empowerment, but empowerment is always something they give to people. And I can feel the self-congratulation in that word empowerment. What I consider empowerment is it's a thing that only comes from within. Your power comes from within, and your power comes from within when you heal, when you are not suppressed and oppressed by your own symptoms and by a system that seems to kind of like your symptoms and keep ignoring them and throwing solutions at you that don't help and not measuring themselves and not rethinking, hey, you know what? The suicide rate just is going up and up. The depression rate is going up and up. Maybe we're not on the right track with this stuff. You know, diabetes is very closely, it's a common chronic illness that is highly correlated with trauma. So if that's the case, I could see this idea like we're going to end trauma and then there won't be diabetes. But what about the people like us who are already adults? We can actually calm other symptoms, our endocrine, diabetes, hypertension, depression, anxiety, addiction. All of these things are helped when we address the dysregulation. Not just the ideological story, not the socioeconomic story. That's all part of it, sure. But what we can change is our awareness of our symptoms and learn to bring those triggers and those symptoms down so that we are able to pay attention to what's going on and have actual choices, and to be tuned into ourselves and our environment enough to say, I tried something and it helped. This thing helped. When something helps you, it's good to keep going with it. When it doesn't help you, please stop attacking yourself or thinking there's something wrong with you. It doesn't help you. So I was angry today and I wanted to say this, and I've often refrained from being so opinionated, but it really bothered me that somebody could go 4 years suffering in a very serious state of depression and never be told about CPTSD. With that, I'm going to leave you with a video. This is a video that I first put out some time back. It was very controversial at the time. I think it's gotten a lot more mainstream now as the research continues to come out, and it's called These Treatments Don't Work, Here's What Does. And I'll leave you with that. That video's right here, and I will see you very soon.